regarding Carmelis. The Gemara had a question whether we would make we're 11b. The Gemara had a question whether we would make the Gzeira, make a rabbinic fence to prohibit a person from standing in public property and drinking in putting his head over and drinking in a Carmelis, a rabbinic prohibited place, just like we prohibited you person standing in public property and bending over into private property unless the majority of his body and his head is over in that other domain. But if only part of his body is in the other domain, we say we're afraid he might take the utensil and draw it to himself, which would be a violation of Shabbat by going from private to public, public to private. So the question of the Gemara was, what's the halacha would we have a similar decree, enactment, concern, and fence with standing in the public property and moving and putting your head over into a Carmelit? That was the Gemara's morning, David. That was the Gemara's question. And we saw, good morning, Mark.
Yeah, Rabbi.
And we saw yesterday that there was an argument between Abaye and Rava whether we will go ahead and make a gezerah and forbade you from standing in public property and sticking your head over into a Carmelit, a rabbinic area, and drinking. So Abaye says we would make the gezerah. We would say we would forbade it because we're afraid you're going to draw the item from the Carmelit, from the rabbinic domain that's prohibited, out to the public property. We'll make a gezerah because the same way you can't carry directly from a Carmelit to a public property or Carmelit to private property, we're gonna make a gezerah that if you're gonna go ahead and stand in one property and stick over in the other property, you might come to draw out the item. And Rava says that will be a gezerah, the gezerah. Rava says the whole issue of carrying from a Carmelit. So therefore, it's a siyag, as David Cohen saying, our Kohen. Therefore, since it's a siyag, it's a fence on a fence. We do not make a fence on a fence. So we said Abaye was upon Abaye to prove his point because he is the one who's saying something novel, something against what we generally say, because he seems to be saying we're going to say by the law of Hotzah, by the law of carrying, we're going to be more strict than the general law all over that we do not say make a gezerah like gezerah. We don't make it, but the fact because of carrying, because that will be different, will be an exception to the rule, and he would make a gezerah the gezerah. He would make a fence on a fence. So the Gemara now, what is the?
Is it the only time we see this, or on other things on Shabbat they do it as well?
So Tosfos says this: out of all the 39 malachot, this is the only one. This is the only malachat, the only type of category of forbidden work, specifically carrying, that we will find this. We'll make a gzeira and gzeira. This is the only case. But what I recall that there are places in Shas throughout the Gemara and other cases, nothing to do with Shabbat, other areas of the Torah, that sometimes we would, it looks like a gzeira, or it looks like we're making a gzeira, but there, everybody would agree you need to make that gzeira in order to eat. Sometimes for the first, for your real gzeira, for your real fence, sometimes if you don't make the second fence, the first fence will not even be used, will not even be made, will not be listened to. So there are times that Tosfos would ask the question, like, how could the Gemara say, how could we have this fence? It seems like it's a fence on a fence. So Tosfos says, there we have to have this double fence because if you don't have that second fence, the first fence wouldn't be. Here, it seems that even if it doesn't meet that criteria, that if you don't have the first fence, the second fence, the first fence won't be listened to. Nevertheless, we'll still make the Abaye feels necessary to make even a Gzera here because of perhaps the situation with carrying, maybe because carrying is a type of malacha, it's a type of act that that needs extra help, perhaps. He's saying that this is unique because of the type of act that it is. This act of carrying. Now, so I'm just going to read to you the commentary here that because they ask, Abaye agrees in general we do not make offense on offense. So one reason why this is different is because carrying from one domain to another domain is a common thing, and because it's such a common thing that people are always carrying, the rabbis were more strict, and they felt, that because it's more possibility that people would come to violate even, and therefore we will make a offense on offense. And the second reason that's given is what we focused on yesterday. We said that people don't understand and appreciate the prohibition of carrying. And because people don't appreciate the prohibition of carrying, and people might be lax in keeping that law properly, so the rabbi said this is an area that you have to strengthen it. This is an area that we're going to have to make offense on offense, because if we don't make offense on offense, this area needs chizuk, needs strengthening. So that would be why perhaps the Abaye holds that, carrying, it's its own world. It has its own rules, its own strict we got to be strict in this area in life. Sometimes you got to say, sometimes we got to be careful by, you got to be careful how much you mingle with the goyim, right? We got to be extra careful, right? Because we're afraid that people might come to intermarry if we overdo it. We overdo our how much we do with them. Good morning, Boker Tov. So maybe certain areas, like the wine of the goyim, right? There's certain things that the rabbis are very strict about, because of the stakes that are so high, the common, or something to that. And if you're not going to be so careful about it, it might be some people might not, so not be, they might not take it as serious as they should. So that is a little bit about this particular situation over here, that Abaye feels that the situation of carrying warrants an extra stringency. So that is to address Mark's question. Now, Amar Abaye, so now we're on 11b1 towards the top of the page, about 5 lines at the top of the page. Amar Abaye mina minala. Where do I ever find that we have by Shabbat, by carrying of Shabbat, we're going to be extra strict. We'll make a double fence. So he says, Diktani v'chein begat. It says the law that applies from Rishut Rabim, Rishut Yochid, Rishut Yochid, Rishut Rabim is the same thing by a gat, by a wine press. And the Gemara says, what is the case of the wine press? The Gemara says, listen, my God, what's the case of this wine press? If this wine press is, let's say, has the measurements of a private domain, 10 tvachim high, 4 tvachim wide, so Tanina, we already learned that you can't stand in a public property and bend over to a private property unless most of your head and most of your body is over. And if this wine press is a small little mini wine press, it's very small, very user-friendly, it's less than 3 tvachim from the ground, less than 11 inches from the ground, so then that's public property. Tanina, we learned you can't stand in private and stick over your head over to private property and to drink. And love Karmel. So what is this case of this Mishnah that says that the law that you can't stand in public property and drink and put your head over into private property, or you can't stand in private property, head into public property, and then it says, and the Mishnah says, and the same law applies to the wine press. what is that case of wine press? As Mr. Haber would say, case might, depends on the case. The case is different. The law might be different. But if it's the same case, you don't have to repeat. You wouldn't say the same case in the Mishnah. So if the Mishnah states, Rishus Rabim, Rishus Yochid, Rishus Yochim, Rishus Rabim, this is another case. So name that too. Name that case. So the Gemara is thinking, it would seem that the case is talking about a rabbinic domain that is like a Carmelite, that a domain that's on a rabbinic level prohibited. You can't stand in public property and stick your head into, even into a Carmelite, even to this rabbinic domain. Why? Even if they move, even if you carry it out, it'd only be offense to offense. It'd only be prohibited because of maybe you might come to do that from public to private or private to public. So we see if you interpret the case, if you interpret the words v'chein begat similarly by a wine press as a Carmelite, as a rabbinic domain, so Abaye has found, he understands that's what the Mishnah is talking about, and he has found a source for his law. And that's why he says his law, because he has this Mishnah, which to him, the case of the Mishnah is talking about standing in public or standing in private and bending over to a Carmelite, to a rabbinic domain. And we don't even allow you to do that unless most of your body and your head is there. But if just your head is moving over, if you're just bending over like this without most of your body and your head, we say you can't do that. Now, why can't I do that? Less because I'm afraid I'm going to take it out. But even if I take it out from that rabbinic domain to the public domain, that's only what rabbinically prohibited, because I might come to carry from a real public domain to a private domain. So it's a fence on a fence. Declare Adam, Mr. Lawyer, we got it? Your Honor, it's too far. And yet, he's a lawyer, by the way, David. And yet, any business deals, I get 10% commission, David. Do you have any contracts, any business you want to work on? It's good to know. Very good to know. And so we see from that Mishnah that the Mishnah states that it would be prohibited to do that. So if by his interpreting the case of the Mishnah as a rabbinic, going from rabbinic domain, it forbade you to drink in that, putting your head over into that rabbinic domain. So the Gemara says, and Rava Amah. How does Rava answer? How does he explain that? He knows there's such a Mishnah, but he says the case is different. That's not what the case of the God is talking about. When it says v'chein begat, when it says the same law applies to a wine press, it's talking the Inyan Maaseh. It's talking about our good friend Ralph, the Levi. It's about giving Maaser, about the responsibility of when you're allowed to drink certain type of drink from the wine press. What does that mean? That means, the Torah says you have to give Maaseh the Gonchav, Tiroshchav, Yitzarecha. You have to give 10% to the Levi of produce that grows in the Holy Land. You got to give 10% to the Levi of your grain, of your wine, morning mark, your grain, your wine, your oil. These are some of the items that the Torah specifies. You got to give 10% to the Levi. Now, this obligation of giving Maaseh to the Levi, at what point do you have the obligation to give it to him? And there is something called tevel. Tevel means the produce before you have tithed the produce, if you did not take off the tithes yet, you didn't separate the 10%, the produce is forbidden to be eaten. Now, when is this prohibition of eating? 11b1. 11b1. When are you prohibited to eat? It's something called for David's food. The truma. Once you separate truma, that truma becomes forbidden for me to eat. Right? The truma, could only be eaten by a kohen. Can't be eaten by a kohen, the kohen's wife, the kohen, right? But that's truma. Maaser that goes to the Levi could be eaten by anybody. The maaser belongs to the Levi. You can give it to anybody to eat. But before the produce, before you separate the maaser, before you take off the maaser, before you take off the tithes, the food, once you finish the processing of the food, and different foods have different levels where it's called the processing has been finished. Once the processing has been completed, at that point, there's an obligation of removal of types, removal of truma, removal of types. And once you have to take off the types, you're not allowed to eat that food until the types have been separated. Okay. But before you finish the processing of taking off the processing of that food, let's talk about the wine. You press the wine. It's not yet finished yet. The processing seems to be finished when it goes down, when you store the wine into the vat or into that pit, whatever on the ground that you store the wine. Until then, if it's in the wine press, it's not yet, it's not done. It's not finished. It's not a finished product. Just think of stuff in the factory that's not ready. If it's not, well, because you didn't maybe because you didn't mix it with water yet. Maybe you didn't dilute it. It's too strong. Yeah, but it's a good point that Mark is saying, but we have to see more about it. But once it comes into the pit, Rashi states, at least Rashi says that as long as it not go down into the pit, now whether they dilute it before it goes into the pit, I'm not sure. But Rashi states, if you know more of the process, Rashi, once it goes down into the pit, after you finish at the press, now that's like the storage area, and now it's in the warehouse, so to speak. And now it's done. The product, call the truck and let's go. We are ready. The thing is ready to roll, right? So that is at that point, once it gets into the pit, now that's if the process is finished with the wine, and now you have the obligation now comes on you to separate the maaser. If you go, it's forbidden for you to eat from that food. Okay, at that point. Now, but fruit that did not reach that level, there are when if the certain foods that didn't reach that level, that wasn't completed yet, all the processing. So if it reaches a certain level of the processing, so the rabbis will, under certain circumstances, say that fruit, that produce, would have a rabbinic responsibility of taking off truma and maaser, meaning a certain level of processing, you already will have rabbinic obligation of separating, and rabbinic obligation will mean I can't eat it beforehand. Again, it goes the Torah only obligates the separation of truma and maaser on the produce once the complete processing has been finished. However, the rabbis have under certain situations will say that once a certain level of the processing has been finished, you might have a rabbinic responsibility to take off at that moment. However, nevertheless, the rabbis did not, this type of fruit, so here in our case for the wine, even though it didn't get down to the pit, if a person is going to be having a type of drinking of the wine in a keva, a more permanent type of way, not temporary, the rabbis will prohibit you to go ahead and, let's say, take the wine out from the press and leave the press, because that they forbade already. If it's by the press, if the wine is still by the press, that's a more of a temporary type of drinking. It's still by the press. It's already when it's already in the store. When it's out, that's already more of a permanency. So therefore, they said like this: the rabbis only, but temporary eating is allowed by this type of food. Now, so we're talking wine that you did not complete its processing because it's still in the wine press. You're allowed to drink this wine a temporary drink. What's a temporary drink? It seems if you buy the press itself, that's one case of temporary drinking. Tasting it or by the press, it's still there. If you drink outside the press, if you remove the wine from the press, meaning you go ahead and it's no longer by the press, that's called more of a permanent type of drinking, because you're going to drink once you don't put it back. Generally, you're not going to once it's outside the press, you're not going to put it back to the press. It's not like it's not still in the, it's not still in the,
Taste that. See if it's good or not. That's what it feels like. Try it working the thing, see the whole time. Have red teeth. They taste more all the time.
and that's a temporary, that seems like a temporary eating. That should be permitted. So in Shulchan Aruch, right. So the general rule, the general rule would be, we'll take a Shulchan Aruch. If you taste for the purpose of enjoyment, if you taste,
Tasting and seeing it spoiled.
like this, there's two levels of tasting. There's tasting and swallowing, and there's tasting and not swallowing, right? So if you taste something, we'll see what the Shulchan Aruch says, but definitely the Ashkenaz opinion. If you taste something with the intention of swallowing and enjoying from it as well. So before Shabbat, I want to taste it and I want to enjoy it. And I swallowed that. We would say a bracha because you swallowed, you taste, and you had intention to what to enjoy it. But if you just taste something just for the purpose of tasting, without right, and right. So that we would have to look more into that.
He spits it out. He doesn't make it.
Right, if you spit it out, right. So I'll get back to you. Look more into that. Here it is. Kuf Ayin Bey. Let's see.
He might be tasting 10 different things. Does he need to visit? The business, no business. My business could be. I mean, he's not tasting it to enjoy it. He's tasting it to prove that it's okay. Right, but they spit it out.
Right. Let's see if we found it. I found something similar, but not your case. Okay, we have to. I'm gonna look up in. It is here it is. I found it. Someone tastes of food. Okay, Shulchan Aruch says, and the Chafetz Chaim says, even though you're not allowed to benefit from this world without a bracha, when you have food, right? Whether eating or drinking, right? Anytime, any amount. If I plan on eating or drinking something, even less than any aside. I want to have 1 ounce of soda, 1 ounce of coffee. I got to say a bracha, any amount, right, David? Say bracha beforehand. For the after bracha, even a certain amount, that's when you have intention to eat and drink. But here, when you're only tasting something to know if it needs salt or spices, or do I got to do something else? Good morning, Sonny. There's no bracha. There's no bracha before or after. Now, so comes the Shulchan Aruch says, now what does the Shulchan Aruch say like this? If you taste the food, you do not, the first opinion of the Shulchan Aruch is, if you taste the food, and you're tasting it just to taste, I want to know what it needs. I do not need to say a bracha for the drink. He says, until the revi'it, technically up to 3 ounces, he says, I would be able to taste. That's the first opinion. However, and then he says, even if you swallow, that's opinion number 1. No, but you could see maybe how long, maybe leave it out more. I don't want. Yeah, there's no bracha. Right.
2 days, could be spoiled, it could be not.
Right.
I want to taste it before I make the juice on it. I can't make it.
Right. So the Shulchan Aruch says, the first opinion Shulchan Aruch says, you can taste it, swallow it, no bracha. Second opinion says, if you, in the Morona Mechaber, this is not, no Ashkenaz talk yet, but good morning, Emmanuel. We're in Sephardi town. This is Sephardi town, USA. Right, good morning, Emmanuel.
Let's be clear.
You like that, Malk? You like that line? First time I said that line, right? Svarty Town, USA. Beautiful. You're allowed to ask that. You're allowed to, yeah, but you gotta know who's the head of the town here. And the second, the Yeshomrim, you gotta know where you are in life. The Yeshomrim, the second opinion Shulchan Aruch says, if you swallow it, you require a blessing because it's something that you do enjoy or there's benefit. What? Right. So that's the second opinion Shulchan Aruch. So you have the first. Right. So you have to. Yes. It's, right. You would need to say a bracha beforehand. That's the second opinion. Now. And we did not exempt the guy to taste it only if he's spitting it out, but not if he's swallowing it. So we have two opinions. So now comes the Ashkenaz rabbi says, Safek bracha lakel. That's his addition to the Mechaber Shulchan Aruch says two opinions, and he doesn't. And Mechaber does not take a position, but he says Safek bracha. The Ramah says, which makes sense, and also the general rule is a lot of times you don't say the bracha, and the fact that the way the Shulchan Aruch writes it, he first writes, if you taste the food, you do not need to say a bracha, even if you swallow it. Then he says, and some say, usually the main opinion would be the first opinion. Because if you say opinion, you state an opinion, you don't say some say, this is the law. And then you say, and some say, that the main opinion is usually the first opinion in such a situation. And so therefore, and also we have this rule called Safek Brachot Lakel. So that's what it seemed to come out according to the Shulchan Aruch. No bracha. Now, that's right. That's, I guess I will tell you. That's according to the Ramah, the Ashkenaz rabbi. Comes the Chafetz Chaim, and the Chafetz Chaim says, the Magen Avraham argues on the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. Some Ashkenaz rabbis argue on the Ashkenaz rabbi. I mean, not everyone agrees always to the Ramah. Not all Ashkenazis agree to the Ramah. And they hold I'm just telling you the Ashkenaz. We already gave the Sephardi opinion. But for Ashkenazim, he says, good morning, Asaf. He says that if you swallow, some Ashkenaz rabbis say you must say a bracha. But many Achronim agree with the Ramah, the Safik bracha, and you will not say a bracha. And therefore, the Chayei Adam says what he recommends to avoid this controversy is it's better if you want to swallow, meaning if you don't swallow, there's no question. If you're only tasting, but if you want to swallow, be careful. I have in mind to drink this wine also for enjoyment. Not for just, I want to taste this wine to see, but I have in mind enjoyment, and therefore I will say a bracha. Now, if you think the item is spoiled and it might not have any enjoyment, so then maybe this might not be a good advice. But if, let's say you want to see, do I need more salt? Right.
I enjoy the taste, and I also thank Hashem for the food that gives me nutrition.
Right. Very good.
So I'm getting nutrition. If I taste something that's cooking, she's making chicken soup, does it need salt? Let me taste it. I'm getting nutrition.
Right. So even though you get nutrition, but the first opinion says, I mean that's the other opinion. Maybe that's the other opinion's opinion. But this first opinion is saying, since I'm not eating, even though I'm getting nutritional value, but I'm not tasting it for the purpose of eating. I might be getting nutritional value, but maybe I'm just tasting. I'm interested in the tasting. So that's the argument, Mark, perhaps what you're saying. But if you have in mind, I'm tasting to see if it needs the chamin needs a little more salt. I can also enjoy it. I can have some. The fact that I might need a little more salt doesn't mean that I'm not eating. So therefore, that's his advice. Have in mind, I'm tasting. I want to swallow it. I'm going to taste it first. I'm going to have in mind to eat it as well, to enjoy whatever flavor it has. Therefore, make a bracha. That would be that's an opinion to avoid perhaps Ashkenaz opinion to avoid the issue. Okay.
Say another bracha when you sit down and eat it after you tasted it.
Yes, because I mean, if you did not get it, that's it. Right. If you made it, Right. But if you did not say the bracha in the beginning, right, I want to be clear, right. If you didn't say the bracha when you tasted it at the beginning, and now you want to eat it, now you would have to now you have to say a bracha. Very good. Okay, this is called practical halacha. We just got some good practical halacha in. Okay.
But feels like no better.
No bracha, right, because you're not bending it. Definitely, right.
And if you drink water, but you're not thirsty, you make a bracha.
No, you don't drink water to make a bracha. You're drinking for the purpose. Because water, you don't have any, there's no taste to water. But if you're thirsty, usually when people drink, they drink because they're thirsty. So therefore, you would have, while you're drinking, probably you're thirsty. Therefore, you would have to say bracha. If let's say you're drinking because you're afraid you shouldn't dehydrate, but I'm not thirsty, and I'm not thirsty at all. But let's say I want to just then maybe you might not make a bracha on that water because I'm not thirsty at all. Okay, that's the right pill. You don't make a bracha on the water for taking a pill. You're getting okay, but that benefit, but again, but again, you help with it. But also, even though you benefit, but you're not.
You don't make a bracha.
But again, but depends. If again, it's like Mark said, it's not a simple thing. Generally speaking, why do you drink? Because you're thirsty. What? Okay, we don't want to. You're very good, but you don't want to make a bracha when it's not required, because then you're saying Hashem's name, right, Asaf, where it's not required. You have to make sure. Generally speaking, the general rule is if you're taking a drink of water, why are you taking a drink of water? You take a drink of water because you're thirsty. If you're thirsty, that means you're not drinking. Then you're drinking for a purpose of thirst. Right. So a person's drinking for his health, and they're not thirsty at all. The doctor said I got to drink a certain amount of water. That would be a good question. That would be a good question. But it has no taste. But it has no taste. The water has no taste. If I'm just drinking, I don't feel any benefit, and I'm not that I was thirsty. That's not true. We know that's not true. If it was true, he wouldn't have been able to say it. But that I want to tell you that we know nobody says it. Huh? Money, and especially women that have more than 20 years experience. We hope they know it by now. So that's a good question regarding the water in the case when I'm not thirsty, just because the doctor told me to drink it. Right? I have no thirst. That would be a good question what to do in that case. Okay. Getting back to our Gemara. So the Gemara says, so the Mishnah is teaching us the following. So we said about Maaser that the wine, when it's in the press itself, and it did not yet go down to the pit, so it does not have any Torah obligation of separating Maaser. But we said if you would remove the wine before it goes down into the pit, if you remove it, then you would have a rabbinic obligation of separating Maaser once it leaves the wine press. Correct? Because
from the press
before the pit, out. If it left the press from the press, instead of going down, it went out. Right. Correct. Yes, and that would be the biblical obligation of responsible takeoff Maaser. But now that it did not go down to the pit, so now the question is, I'm saying you said the obligation, the Torah obligation does not begin until it gets into that vat, that storage place. But because it's not called finish the process. What's the vat? It holds the wine, right? Now? So that's what it's Mishnah says. The same law by the wine press is the following: that when is there a rabbinic law of restricting you from drinking from this wine press? The same law applies if I stick my head over into the wine press. That type of drinking is considered. Just my head. If my head and my most of my body is over into the wine press, that's called temporary. Just like if I was standing on the wine press itself, and I will be drinking from the wine press itself before I went into the pit, I'm allowed to. That's called a temporary drinking. So too, if I go ahead and I stand over, even though I'm standing in public property outside the wine press, but if most of my body is over into the wine press, I could drink from the wine press because that's called a temporary drinking. However, if I don't have most of my body and my head into the wine press, just my head is in the wine press, but the rest of my body is outside the wine press. So once the majority of your body's outside the wine press, that's not called a temporary drinking. And therefore, you cannot, therefore, it's obligated. What was it? I'm more back. I'm not on the wine press so much. And therefore, rabbinically, I can't drink from that wine press if I'm not head and body. Say it again. Right. Let's say here, it's more not so much public and private. It's more, am I in the press or out of the press? No. So the difference out is regarding whether the rabbis already said there's a rabbinic law. Am I allowed to drink it? Am I allowed to drink it? That's it. Right. Once it's not in the back pit yet. It's on the wine press. It's on the wine press. The wine. It's more like a permanent. It's like one drink, and therefore I would have to take off money wrap, but I have to take off Maset. Okay, we'll see more tomorrow. I want to wish everyone a beautiful day. Great day, everybody. Coming now?
Yeah.
Okay. I could do a few minutes now.
Yeah. Very good.
I was saying, I thought I could. No idea.